On a quiet afternoon in a busy town square, a young boy sat in his wheelchair, his eyes lowered as cruel laughter echoed around him. Strangers passed by, some pretending not to notice, others too afraid to intervene. The boy, living every day with a disability, had long grown used to whispers and stares, but this time the mockery cut deeper. Surrounded and humiliated, he seemed smaller than ever, as if the weight of the world had decided to rest solely on his fragile shoulders. But destiny has a way of choosing its moments, and help came not in silence, but in thunder. From down the street, the sound of engines broke through the cruelty, dozens of motorcycles rumbling like a storm on the horizon. Heads turned, conversations stopped, and those who mocked began to hesitate. The ground seemed to shake beneath the weight of something greater than machines: loyalty, unity, and unyielding protection. The boy lifted his head, confused at first, as leather-clad figures rode closer, their presence filling the air with an energy that silenced the crowd. The bikers were not strangers to pain, nor unfamiliar with judgment, and in that boy's trembling hands they saw a reflection of battles they had fought in their own lives. Without hesitation, they parked their bikes in a circle around him, creating a shield stronger than steel, a wall of humanity built not with bricks, but with loyalty. The bullies who moments before had laughed now stood frozen, their bravado crumbling beneath the piercing stares of men and women who lived by a different code. The bikers did not raise fists. They didn't need to. Their silence spoke louder than any shout. This child was no longer alone, and cruelty would not have the final word. The balance of power shifted in an instant, and those who had thrived on weakness were now the ones exposed. In that moment, the boy's eyes filled not with tears of shame, but with something far greater, hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe, valued, and seen. What had begun as an ordinary day of humiliation had been rewritten into a story of protection and unexpected heroes. The engines that once sounded intimidating became the music of salvation, a promise that even in the darkest moments, there are always those willing to stand and defend what is right. The bikers did not arrive as strangers. They arrived as guardians, carrying with them a reputation built on loyalty, respect, and a code of honor that went far beyond the roar of their engines. As they surrounded the boy, the air shifted, and the crowd that once seemed so powerful shrank back in silence. The boy, who had been trembling only moments before, now sat at the very center of an unbreakable circle. His heartbeat slowed, his fears softened, and for the first time in that painful afternoon, he understood that he was not invisible. The leader of the club, a man with weathered skin and a steady gaze, knelt down beside the boy. He did not speak loudly, nor did he need to. With a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, he whispered words only the child could hear. "You are stronger than you know. They cannot touch you while we are here." It was not just reassurance. It was a promise, carved into the boy's heart like a shield against the cruelty he had endured for so long. Around them, the other bikers stood like sentinels. Their eyes scanned the crowd, their silence heavy with meaning. They had seen too much injustice in their lives to let another moment of it unfold unchecked. Each one of them carried scars, some visible, others hidden. But those scars had taught them the value of protection, the sacred duty of standing for the voiceless. And in that moment, they found in the boy a reason to fight that went deeper than any brotherhood ride. The bullies, once loud and cruel, began to scatter. They had fed on weakness, but now they faced a wall of strength that no amount of mockery could pierce. Their laughter faltered, their arrogance dissolved, and shame clung to them as they slinked away. The crowd that had stood idle moments earlier now shifted uneasily, some clapping quietly, others lowering their eyes, realizing they had been witnesses to cruelty when they could have been defenders. And the boy, still silent in his chair, felt something change within him. Where fear had taken root, pride began to grow. He looked at the bikers not as strangers, but as giants, giants who had chosen him, in his moment of weakness, to remind the world that compassion can roar louder than cruelty. The story did not end in that square. Word of the incident spread quickly, carried first by those who had witnessed it, and then by the whispers of admiration that traveled farther than anyone expected. Soon, The boy's story was being told in homes, schools, and even on news channels, where the image of bikers standing around a disabled child became a symbol of unexpected heroism. What had begun as a single act of defense grew into a message powerful enough to touch hearts far beyond the town. The boy himself felt the change most deeply. He had spent years shrinking into the background, afraid of drawing attention, afraid of being reminded of the body that made him different. But the Bikers Act planted a seed of courage inside him. For the first time, he dared to lift his head in public, to meet the eyes of strangers, and to believe that he was worthy of being seen, not for his disability, but for his strength. The bikers did not abandon him after that day. They returned, not with engines blazing, but with friendship and time. They visited his home, shared meals with his family, and brought him along to rides where he felt the wind against his face as the motorcycles carried him forward. For the boy, every outing was a declaration that life was not limited by what he could not do, but expanded by the people who refused to let him face the world alone. Meanwhile, the community's perception of the bikers began to shift. Where once they had been viewed with suspicion, judged by their rough exteriors and roaring machines, they were now seen as protectors, people who lived by a code of honor that many had forgotten. Parents pointed them out to their children, not with fear, but with admiration, saying, "These are the ones who stood up when no one else did." And slowly, the boy who had once been harassed in public became a symbol of hope. His story was no longer about cruelty, but about courage. The courage of bikers who refused to look away, and the courage of a child who discovered that even in weakness, there is a strength that can transform not only a moment, but an entire community. As weeks passed, the bond between the boy and the bikers grew unshakable. He was no longer just a child in a wheelchair. He became their little brother, the heart of the club. Whenever the bikers gathered, there was a chair reserved for him, a place where he belonged without question. He wore their jackets, oversized and heavy on his small frame, but when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see weakness anymore. He saw strength reflected back at him, borrowed from the family that had chosen him. The boy's parents, once hesitant and fearful of the biker's rough image, soon saw the truth behind the leather and the steel. They watched as their son smiled more, spoke louder, and carried himself with newfound pride. They listened to the bikers' laughter echoing in their kitchen as they shared stories of roads traveled and lessons learned. The bikers were no longer strangers. They were protectors who had given their son something priceless, a reason to believe in himself again. The bullies, on the other hand, found themselves exposed. Their cruelty had been dragged into the light, and whispers followed them wherever they went. Teachers, neighbors, and even their own friends began to question the actions that once made them feel powerful. The tables had turned. What once seemed like dominance had become shame, and what once seemed like weakness had become undeniable strength. The boy, encouraged by the support around him, began to speak publicly about his experience. With bikers by his side, he stood before his school and told his classmates that words can wound more deeply than fists, but kindness can heal even the deepest scars. His voice was steady, his eyes unflinching, and the silence that followed his words carried more weight than any applause. For the first time, he was not just surviving his disability, he was leading with it. And in those moments, the bikers realized that their act of protection had created something larger than themselves. They had not only shielded a boy from cruelty, they had ignited a voice that would echo far beyond the square where the story began. The image of the bikers defending the boy continued to spread, touching hearts across the nation. News outlets revisited the story, and interviews revealed the depth of the club's philosophy. That true strength is measured by how you protect those who cannot protect themselves. The rough edges of their appearance were stripped away in the eyes of the public, replaced by the undeniable truth that compassion can be found in the most unexpected places. The boy's life blossomed in ways he had never imagined. Invitations came from organizations and schools asking him to share his story, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. With every word he spoke, he carried the spirit of the bikers with him, reminding audiences that even the smallest act of courage can change a life forever. His wheelchair was no longer a symbol of limitation. It was a throne of strength. For the bikers, what had begun as a single act of defiance against cruelty became a mission. They started patrolling neighborhoods, not to intimidate, but to ensure safety for those who lived in fear. They visited schools, speaking about respect and loyalty, dismantling stereotypes with every gesture of kindness. Children once afraid of the roar of engines now ran to greet them, waving with wide eyes and open smiles. The politician who had once criticized the bikers for their lawless image was forced into silence as their influence grew. Community leaders began inviting them into conversations about safety and justice, acknowledging what was clear to everyone. These men and women were not outlaws. They were guardians. The line between fear and respect had been erased, replaced with admiration. And through it all, the boy remained at the center, a reminder of why it had all begun. His laughter was louder, his spirit brighter, and his courage greater than ever before. The bikers had defended him once, but now he carried the power to inspire others, proving that even the smallest spark of kindness can light a fire that changes the world. The boy's transformation became impossible to ignore. Once quiet and withdrawn, he now carried himself with a confidence that inspired everyone around him. His classmates began to look at him differently, not with pity, but with respect. When he rolled into the schoolyard, children who had once whispered behind his back now greeted him with admiration, remembering the day the bikers had stood for him. His story was no longer about being a target of cruelty, but about the strength of standing tall in the face of it. The bikers continued to visit him, each ride becoming more than just a moment of thrill. It became a lesson. They taught him about resilience, about how scars, whether on the skin or the heart, are proof of survival. They showed him that true courage isn't about never being hurt, but about choosing to rise every time you're pushed down. The boy absorbed these lessons like fuel, each word igniting a fire that carried him forward. His parents watched with awe as their son flourished. The boy who once avoided eye contact now spoke at the dinner table with stories of hope. He laughed more, dreamed bigger, and carried himself with a new sense of pride. His disability had not changed, but the way he saw himself had. And that was the greatest transformation of all. The bullies, meanwhile, had been forced into silence. Their cruelty, once hidden in the safety of a crowd, had been dragged into the open. Shame followed them, and they were left to confront the truth of their actions. The balance of power had shifted completely, reminding everyone who had once stayed silent that it is never too late to stand on the side of justice. And while the bikers never claimed glory for what they had done, the boy himself became their legacy. Every smile, every word of courage, every step into the future was a reminder of the day a group of strangers chose to shield him, not with fists, but with loyalty, compassion, and an unbreakable code of honor. The boy's voice grew louder beyond his school and town. Invitations came from community centers and youth groups, asking him to share what he had lived through. And each time he spoke, his story carried the same powerful truth. Kindness can roar louder than cruelty, and no one deserves to face their battles alone. His wheelchair, once a symbol of vulnerability, became a platform that elevated his voice, showing the world that courage wears many forms. The bikers often accompanied him to these events, sitting quietly at the back while he spoke. They did not need to stand in the spotlight. The boy was the light they had ignited, and they were content to let him shine. Every word he shared carried pieces of their brotherhood, woven into the story of a child who had been broken by mockery and rebuilt by love. Communities began to change. Parents told their children about the boy and the bikers, reminding them that true strength comes not from hurting others, but from protecting them. Teachers invited the bikers into classrooms to talk about respect and unity, dismantling the stereotypes that had long surrounded them. What had begun as a single act of defense had grown into a movement of awareness, teaching thousands that compassion is the greatest form of power. Even the boy's doctors noticed a change. His health improved, his spirit brighter than ever before, and his progress exceeded expectations. Science could not measure the depth of hope, but it was clear that his newfound courage was healing him in ways medicine never could. His heart beat stronger because it had found something to fight for. And as he looked at the men and women who had once ridden into his life like a storm, he understood a truth that would stay with him forever. Family is not always the one you are born into. It is the one that chooses you when the world turns its back. And that choice, that loyalty, had given him not just protection for a moment, but strength for a lifetime. As the boy's story spread, it began to reach people far beyond his small town. Families with children facing disabilities wrote letters to him, sharing how his courage had given them hope. Some traveled miles just to meet him, to let their children see that they were not alone in their struggles. Each encounter filled the boy with a deeper sense of purpose. His pain had been transformed into power, his humiliation into hope for others. He was no longer just a boy who had been bullied. He was a voice for countless others who had suffered in silence. The bikers watched with pride as the boy grew into a symbol of resilience. For them, it was never about recognition or fame. It was about knowing that, in a world often cold and indifferent, they had chosen to stand up for what was right. Each time they saw the boy smile, they were reminded why their code of loyalty and honor mattered more than any judgment from society. They had once been feared. Now they were respected, not because they had demanded it, but because they had earned it. The community, once hesitant to embrace them, now saw the bikers in a new light. Parents who had once told their children to avoid the roar of motorcycles now waved with gratitude. Businesses offered support, schools invited collaboration, and strangers greeted them with warmth instead of suspicion. The transformation was undeniable. The bikers had rewritten their story, not with words, but with actions that could not be ignored. The bullies, left behind in the shadows of their shame, had no choice but to watch as the boy they once tormented became a figure admired by thousands. Their cruelty had birthed a movement they could never stop. In a bitter twist of fate, their attempt to break him had only made him stronger and exposed the emptiness of their own strength. And through it all, the boy never forgot the day it all began. The sound of engines thundering into the square, the circle of protection around his chair, the promise whispered into his ear. That moment had changed everything. It had taught him that sometimes heroes arrive not in capes, but in leather jackets, carrying scars of their own and hearts strong enough to carry others. One evening, under the fading glow of the setting sun, the boy and the bikers gathered once more in the town square where it had all begun. The place that once held memories of cruelty now stood as a monument of resilience. People came to join them, neighbors, teachers, parents, and children, all drawn by the story that had become larger than life. The boy, sitting in his chair surrounded by his guardians, smiled as he realized that he was no longer the scared child he once had been. The leader of the club placed a jacket on the boy's shoulders, this time stitched with the club's emblem. It was not just fabric. It was a declaration that he was one of them, a brother in their circle, equal in dignity and strength. The crowd cheered, and the boy's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of pride. He had been chosen, not because of what he lacked, but because of the strength he carried within. The moment became a turning point not just for the boy, but for the community itself. The story of a disabled child shielded by bikers had evolved into something much greater. A reminder that unity can be found in the most unexpected places, and that kindness, when lived boldly, can transform entire lives. People left that gathering not as spectators, but as witnesses to a truth they could no longer ignore. From that day forward, the boy no longer felt defined by his disability. He saw himself as a warrior of resilience, a symbol of what happens when courage meets compassion. And the bikers, though they would eventually ride into other towns and face other battles, knew that they had left behind something eternal. Their legacy was not their strength, but the strength they had inspired in him. The square, once echoing with cruel laughter, now echoed with a different sound: hope. And every time the engines roared through that town again, people did not turn away in fear. They smiled, waved, and remembered the day the bikers came, not just to defend a boy, but to remind everyone that no act of cruelty is greater than the power of standing together. Months later, the boy was no longer simply the child who had been bullied. He had become a symbol of courage, a living reminder that compassion can rise in the most unexpected ways. Across schools, his name was spoken as an example of resilience, and his story was used to teach children about kindness, dignity, and the strength of standing together. His wheelchair, once a mark of vulnerability, now carried the weight of a legacy that was inspiring thousands. The bikers, proud but humble, continued to ride with him whenever they could. They never sought recognition, yet their bond with the boy brought them respect wherever they went. To them, it was not about glory but about brotherhood. In him, they saw the reflection of a world they wanted to protect: innocence, hope, and the courage to endure even when life felt unfair. Every time the engines roared, it was a reminder that their mission was bigger than themselves. The boy's parents could hardly recognize the son they once worried about. His smile was brighter, his voice carried further, and his dreams had grown bolder. He began speaking of becoming an advocate for others like him, promising that no child would ever again feel as alone as he once had. Their pride was immeasurable, and their gratitude to the bikers was endless. They knew that fate had delivered these unlikely heroes into their son's life for a reason. Communities across the country reached out to the biker club, asking them to share their message and presence. They traveled, not as rebels, but as guardians, bringing with them the spirit of loyalty and compassion that had defined their story with the boy. Wherever they went, they were welcomed not with fear, but with open arms. Their leather jackets, once symbols of intimidation, had become badges of honor. And at the center of it all remained the boy, his courage magnified by the love that surrounded him. His journey from shame to pride was more than a personal triumph. It was a testament to what can happen when people refuse to look away, when strangers choose to protect instead of harm, and when kindness is allowed to thunder louder than cruelty. Years later, the memory of that day in the square still lived vividly in the boy's heart. Though he grew older, he never forgot the moment when engines roared to his defense and strangers became family. He carried it with him into every stage of his life, using it as a compass to guide his choices, his words, and his dreams. That single act of loyalty had reshaped the course of his future forever. The bikers, too, held on to that memory. It became one of their most treasured stories, passed down to new members as proof of what their brotherhood stood for. They told it not to boast, but to remind each other of the responsibility they carried, to be protectors, to stand where others would not, and to ensure that dignity was never stripped away from the vulnerable. It was no longer just a moment. It had become part of their code. The town itself carried the legacy. The square that had once echoed with cruel laughter was now remembered as the place where courage triumphed over mockery. People spoke of it as a turning point, proof that a single act of kindness could ripple outward to change entire lives. For children growing up there, the story of the boy and the bikers became folklore, a living legend that taught them to choose compassion over cruelty. The boy, now a young man, often revisited the square. Sometimes he came alone, other times with the bikers still by his side. He would pause in the very spot where it had all begun, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that had shaped him, for the strangers who had become his shield, and for the lesson that had forever changed the way he saw the world. And as the engines roared one last time on those quiet evenings, the truth echoed louder than any voice could. Cruelty may wound, but courage heals. And sometimes, all it takes is a circle of unlikely heroes to remind the world that kindness, when chosen boldly, can change everything. In the end, this was never just the story of a boy in a wheelchair or the bikers who came to his defense. It became something far greater, a reminder that the measure of a community lies not in its power or wealth, but in its willingness to stand for the most vulnerable. What began with cruelty in a public square ended with courage that reached across generations, teaching all who witnessed it that dignity must never be left unprotected. The boy, once silenced by shame, found his voice because strangers chose loyalty over indifference. The bikers, judged by their rough exteriors, revealed a truth the world could not ignore. That strength is not about intimidation, but about compassion that refuses to look away. Together, they showed that kindness is not weakness, but the very force that dismantles cruelty and reshapes lives. This story challenges us to ask ourselves a question. When we see injustice, will we stay silent, or will we choose to act? Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with fists or laws, but with presence, courage, and the choice to stand by someone who cannot stand alone. And when we do, we create moments that echo far beyond a single day, becoming lessons that inspire for a lifetime. The roar of the engines may fade, but the echo of their act remains. A reminder that ordinary people can become extraordinary protectors when love and loyalty drive their actions. And the boy, once harassed in public, became a living symbol that hope can rise from pain, that scars can become strength, and that courage can be born in the most unexpected places. If this story touched you, let's stay alive beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice may inspire someone else to act with kindness. And if you believe that more stories like this should be told, support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. Together, we can ensure that these lessons of courage and compassion continue to reach hearts and remind the world that kindness, when chosen boldly, can truly change everything.